Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, Vaush, conservatives being hypocritical, and you're going to say that, and then you're going to put your hand on your head like this, and you're going to faint onto a fainting couch because the sheer shock of the idea of conservatives being hypocritical should be enough to send any of you into a stupor. But here we are.
Yeah, I agree. Conservatives do tend to be hypocritical. But let's be honest, liberals are pretty hypocritical as well.
So, if you asked the average American what the party of law and order was, what would they tell you?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of anyone else, but in my opinion, I believe that the Libertarian Party would be the party of law and order. And that's because libertarianism is based on the idea that laws should be based on some higher objective moral principle, which is the rule of law, as opposed to the rule of man, which is when the laws are based on the arbitrary opinion of whoever happens to be in charge at any given time.
You know? Like, what's the party that keeps talking about the importance of respecting police, and the law, and being hard on crime, and, well, it's time to disobey all order. How do you do Charlie Kirk's voice? All orders that violate our natural rights. No more curfews, lockdowns, or authoritarian measures. Disobey, resist, defy, open America. Weren't these people literally just like a few months ago talking about the rule of law when it came to Black Lives Matter?
So Vaush is basically trying to make the point that conservatives are being hypocritical because they simultaneously criticize groups like Black Lives Matter for violating the law and support violating the law when it comes to COVID-19 measures. Now, whether or not conservatives are actually being hypocritical here, that is open for discussion. However, I think we can all agree that not closing down your business over a virus with a less than 2% mortality rate is a little different from flipping cars and lighting shit on fire. I mean, I think you could have reasonable grounds to criticize one but not the other and not be hypocritical.
It's not just Charlie Kirk either. This is becoming like an orthodox conservative opinion.
It's not just Charlie Kirk, or even conservatives for that matter, who are criticizing the COVID lockdowns. Plenty of libertarians, and even liberals, are also criticizing lockdowns. Yeah, believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit of opposition for lockdowns on the left as well. So it's not like this is even a solely conservative position.
That handling a pandemic.
Just because someone is against lockdowns doesn't necessarily mean they're against handling the pandemic at all. Even if we are to just take for granted that coronavirus is actually as deadly as people are making it out to be, lockdowns aren't the only or even the best way to deal with it. One alternative to lockdowns that's actually supported by quite a few people in the medical and scientific field, even quite a few people on the left, is the Great Barrington Declaration. I'll put a link to a video by Tom Woods in the description which discusses it further, but the basic idea behind the Great Barrington Declaration is that we can actually let young, healthy people with strong immune systems go out and live their life like normal, while we focus all our time and energy on targeted protections focused on specific people who are more vulnerable. Which sounds like a good solution to me, because, we're still keeping people safe, but just not at the expense of destroying people's lives.
And the laws... Look at this. Civil disobedience? Calling on all patriots to disobey.
Yes, and I 100% agree. See, a lot of people seem to still hold this belief that if we just act like good little children and do what Dr. Fauci says, eventually we'll have our freedom back. And I'd understand people believing that maybe early on in the pandemic. Oh, we've shut down our businesses, we wore the masks, we did the social distancing, we did all that, and 1 year later we're still dealing with this shit. Now that vaccines are being rolled out, now that it looks like there's light at the end of the tunnel, once again changing the narrative, oh, well, now there's vaccine-resistant variants, so even once you get the vaccine you can't have your life back. Like, at this point, it's abundantly clear that they have no intention of giving you your freedom back at all. So we're probably going to end up having to take it back. I think Computing Forever put it best in one of his videos. More obedience just leads to more restrictions. You see, what's going to end this pandemic ultimately isn't going to be vaccines or herd immunity or anything like that. It's going to be us saying that enough is enough. We're not going to obey your arbitrary restrictions anymore. And until that happens, you can expect more restrictions. As long as these people can get away with it, they're going to. It's as simple as that.
I could react incredulously to this, but anyone who knows how American conservatism works understands that this is pretty par for the course. So let me lay it out for you, okay? When black people are protesting police and brutality, injustice, systemic inequality, the rule of law is extremely important.
I can't speak on behalf of anyone else, but I personally don't mind if Black Lives Matter wants to protest. They have the same right to voice their grievances as does anyone else. The problem is when shit gets violent. When they start attacking people or destroying property, that's what I have a problem with. Like if Black Lives Matter or any other organization just wants to peacefully assemble and voice their grievances against what they feel to be injustices, I'm fine with that. But you lose my support the second your protest turns into a riot.
If a black kid gets capped by an officer in the back of the head because they were somewhere within 3 blocks of a crime scene that ended up being committed by a white guy, well, sorry, Mr. Black Guy. Rule of law, should have been inside or something. I don't know. There's probably a law for that.
I don't understand why people keep trying to make police brutality into a race issue. Like, when you try to make this an issue of white people versus black people, you're creating a sense of us versus them, which is ultimately counterproductive to actually addressing the problem. Like, I don't want to make this a race issue at all. Police brutality is a social injustice that affects all of us. Even if police brutality was a problem that disproportionately affected black people, which, I mean, the data paints a different picture, but let's assume it, that still wouldn't justify making it a race issue. Just because a problem is disproportionately affecting one group of people doesn't make it any less of an injustice if it happens to someone in another group of people. Like, a cop beating the shit out of an innocent person is bad, regardless of what her skin color that person is.
Any perceived George Floyd, what did he with the what was it? He got called on. He had fentanyl. Sorry, drugs are illegal. Time to die.
So Vaush is on the right track when he acknowledges that drug laws entail initiating force, oftentimes lethal, against people who haven't actually done anything wrong. But he fails to sort of take this logic full circle and acknowledge that this applies to all forms of government authoritarianism. Let's for a moment grant the whole left-wing narrative that police officers are a bunch of bloodthirsty racists who will exploit whatever excuse they can to prey on black people. Whether or not you agree with this conception of police officers is a different story. We're just assuming it for the sake of getting a point across for the time being. Couldn't police use these same government authoritarian COVID measures as a pretense to kill or harass black people as they do with the drug laws? Let's try a thought experiment here. Let's suppose that instead of being under arrest for possession of drugs, George Floyd was under arrest for violating some sort of COVID curfew, and that's what ultimately led the officer to choke him to death. Do you think Vaush, or the left wing in general, would be just as outraged about that, or do you think in that case they would blame Floyd because in this case the police were enforcing something they're sympathetic with? As a matter of fact, we don't even necessarily have to speculate. A police officer in New York actually beat the snot out of someone for simply not wearing a mask. Now, since this is an instance of enforcing COVID rules, which is something that the left seems to be sympathetic with, it makes sense why they're being much less vocal about this incident.
The absolute seething contempt that conservatives have for especially black people when it comes to civil disobedience is unfathomable. They scream about cities being on fire. They scream about how America's rule of law is being torn down.
So I do agree that there's a bit of a tendency for conservatives to kind of blow these protests out of proportion. I do think that most BLM protests are simply well-intentioned people gathering together to voice their concerns. Like, there was a BLM protest in the town where I live, and it went down pretty peacefully. Some of our cops even gave a speech to the protesters, and it seemed to kind of jive with them. So yeah, I'd say that most BLM protests are peaceful. But of course, peaceful protests don't get the media as much rating, so that's why the violent ones are always in the public spotlight. But even granting that most BLM protests are peaceful, that doesn't excuse the actions of those who misbehave. Like, sorry, but systematic racism, wherever you're complaining about, doesn't give you a free pass to throw bricks through windows.
They do this with immigration too. Even though, mind you, being an illegal immigrant is like an incredibly minor infraction of the law. Like, the actual like violation of the law, it's very, very, very minor.
Okay, well, so is not closing your business. I'd argue that people voluntarily making the conscious decision to accept the risks of COVID-19 and go out and have mass gatherings is also a very minor infraction of the law.
They will scream because the data supports immigration. Like, immigrants don't hurt the economy. They don't hurt us fiscally. They don't hurt us culturally. They don't commit more crime. So usually when conservatives run out of arguments against like naturalizing the undocumented immigrants we have in our country, they default to like, well, rule of law, they broke the law, so like we can't reward that.
This is kind of a similar problem as before with the drug laws. Vaush acknowledges the problem with one form of authoritarianism, but still advocates for another. So it's not legitimate for the government to stop people from crossing an imaginary line, but it is legitimate for the government to stop people from leaving their homes, or to engage in certain types of commerce that they mutually agree to. And I'm not sure if Vaush is aware of this or not, but even conservatives are hijacking the COVID narrative to try and push their immigration policies. They're trying to say that by not sealing the border, Biden is exposing everyone to COVID-19 from illegal immigrants. Now, of course, it is pretty obvious to everyone that conservatives don't really care about COVID. They're just using this to push their border agenda. But it is a good example of how there can be harmful unintended consequences of pushing this COVID narrative the way the left is.
But then they go ahead and do shit like this. So let me see if I understand this properly. When we have a historic civil rights protest, that's when rule of law matters most.
What do you mean by historic civil rights protest? I mean, the left likes to make it out as if racism is like this huge prevalent issue, which, I mean, I'm sure it still is an issue. I'm sure there is still some racism out there, but in almost every way, the quality of life of your average African American is on par with that of your average white. As a matter of fact, black people get stuff like affirmative action and minority scholarships from universities. So it's like they're getting better than equality. They're getting special treatment. I don't know what more you could possibly want.
But when we're trying to deal with a fucking pandemic, now it's time for all of the citizens to rise up and to fight against.
Well, Vaush, if you want to talk about hypocrisy, how about this? Anytime someone goes out to try to do something that even vaguely resembles fun, going to hang out with their friends, going to a bar, watching a sporting event, anything that involved being an actual human being and not staying at home staring at a wall all day, the left wing would shame you, berate you. How dare you go out and actually have fun? You're being a super spreader, you're going to kill people. But then all of a sudden, when the George Floyd incident happened, these same left wingers who were just shaming the rest of us for going out and having mass gatherings were gathering together in massive droves to protest what happened to George Floyd. Now, I'm not trying to defend or downplay what happened to George Floyd at all. That was unacceptable. But there's some very blatant hypocrisy going on when you shame the rest of us who want to just spend some time with their friends or family as being super spreaders, when all these BLM protests are some of the biggest mass gatherings I've ever seen. And they always come up with some sort of excuse like, protesting systemic racism is an essential activity. So your small business that you spent years of your life working hard to create, that's not essential. But apparently bitching about problems that ended in the 60s is.
They say even cops, dude.
I will say this. As horribly awful and destructive this whole pandemic has been, there are several silver linings that have come out of it. And one of them is that conservatives are starting to reconsider their support of law enforcement. All this time conservatives have been bending over backwards to kiss the police's ass. I think this pandemic is sort of waking them up to the fact that cops serve the government, not them.
Look at this. Any police officer who enforces unlawful COVID curfews, first of all, that's not what unlawful means.
Well, I mean, you do have to admit that the legal basis for a lot of these COVID orders is a bit dubious. For example, a lot of these orders aren't going through the proper democratic legislative process. A lot of them are just being issued as executive edicts. A lot of them are also based on emergency powers, which, contrary to popular belief, are not a carte blanche, but are actually very specific and narrow. If you look at the emergency powers in any state constitution, it'll basically say, in an emergency, you're allowed to do this, no more.
Does not serve the American people, and any American who resists would be right to do so. Look at that. Any American who resists the police would be right to do so if the police are attempting to enforce COVID curfews.
So here's my stance that I'm not ashamed to admit. If you're a police officer or a government agent, and you try to force somebody to close their business, I am A-okay with that business owner shooting you in self-defense. Sorry, but your badge or uniform doesn't give you a special right to go around harassing people. It just doesn't.
But curfews enforced by governors following BLM protests, that's totally legitimate.
I'm not aware if state governors are implementing lockdowns following BLM protests. I mean, if they are, I'm against that as well. But I will say, at least in that case, there's something that actually poses a danger to you. Like if a virus with a less than 2% mortality rate is a good reason to lock down, then rioters chucking bricks, glass bottles, and Lord knows what else is definitely a good reason to.
Listen. Conservatives don't give a fuck about the law. They don't give a single shit about the law. If it were lefties saying this about literally anything, Fox News would be lighting up. President Trump would be lighting up about these instigators, these terrorists. They would be called terrorists. What is this? Disobey, resist, defy? If there were people saying this, and they were with BLM, they were being called terrorists. because they were inciting civil disobedience against police officers.
So I do agree somewhat that conservatives are being a bit hypocritical here, but this doesn't necessarily invalidate the criticisms they're making against things like lockdowns.
Look, if you believe that America, which is currently buckling under the weight of COVID-19.
The only reason America's buckling under the weight of COVID-19 is because the government is imposing all these unnecessary measures. All lockdowns do is just destroy the economy. They don't even really stop the virus from spreading. Had we treated this the same way we do any other seasonal illness, let the young people with strong immune systems go out and catch it while we focus protections on certain people who are more vulnerable, we could have gotten out of this way better than we did.
If you believe that America it is fundamentally un-American. It is unethical for us to implement these COVID lockdowns or to implement curfews or to do any of these restrictions. Okay, I mean, you're kind of a fucking idiot.
Oh, well, I guess the majority of scientists and doctors who support the Great Barrington Declaration are a bunch of fucking idiots then.
Because by the way, I've never met a person who opposed lockdowns who didn't also not understand how COVID-19 works. That's the key distinction there. If I met a person who opposed lockdowns or opposed any mandates, but also perfectly understood what COVID-19 is, what it does, how rapidly it's spreading through society, and still held those positions, maybe we could have that discussion. But everybody who opposes these government measures are also the people who downplay the virus. So,
well, first of all, it's usually the lockdowners who don't understand how COVID spreads. For example, one thing that lockdowners usually support is curfews. Yeah, the virus somehow gives a fuck what time it is for some unexplained reason. But even if COVID really was as deadly as people make it out to be, as a matter of fact, even if it was deadlier than that, even if it was as deadly as people make it out to be times 10, I would still be against government lockdowns. Because I believe as a sovereign, sentient individual, it's ultimately my right to decide what level of risk I'm willing to take. If I decide the risk of getting sick is worth living my life like normal, I feel that's my right to make that decision, regardless of how deadly the risk is.
Oh, it's like COVID-19, or not COVID-19, sorry. It's like climate change deniers, Climate change deniers will be like, we can't, do you know how expensive it would be to build all these solar panels? And you're like, yeah, but the world's going to end. And then they're like, well, no. Like, maybe it gets like a little hotter, but like, isn't that good for the environment for it to be hotter? Then it means the plants eat more oxygen. And then you're like, no, it's not good. Like, we're seriously gonna, like, the planet will be made uninhabitable for human life. And they're like, no, and you're really not selling me on the cost of those solar panels. That's the thing. You can only have a reasonable discussion about solutions to a problem when you agree on the severity of the problem. Anyway, tangent.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break.
It's not necessarily that we don't agree on the severity of the problem. It's that what left-wingers tend to do is they take these really complex issues that society is facing, and they like to kind of boil it down to a simple binary. Like, here's our specific solution that we want, and if you don't approve of it, then you simply don't take the problem seriously. What if, by chance, I do take the problem seriously, but simply just disagree with your solution? Rolling with the example we gave with climate change, what if the reason someone's against solar panels isn't because they're anti-solar panel, or they don't take climate change seriously, but rather that they support nuclear power instead, because nuclear power produces no CO2, is commercially viable, and works in all weather conditions? What if maybe it's the case that we do take the issue seriously, it's just that your binary way of framing it is bullshit?
Whatever the case may be, listen, always remember, always and forever remember, conservatives don't give a fuck about law, they don't give a fuck about the rule of law, they don't give a fuck about order. The only thing conservatives care about, the only thing they've ever cared about, is using the law when it can suppress minorities. That's it. Look back throughout history. Every single time conservatism has worn the mantle of law and order, it has been against minorities. They did it against the gay people back in the 1980s. They did it against the civil rights protesters back in the day. And wouldn't you know it, if you go back far enough, you'll see the exact same law and order rhetoric being applied to crackdowns against abolitionists back during the slave days. That, it's lawful and orderly to allow slave masters to continue to own their property, and that it is a disruption of that order to protest in favor of the humanity of black people.
But Vaush, weren't you using the same law and order rhetoric in your debate with Adam Kokesh? If you guys have ever seen a debate between Vaush and Adam Kokesh, it's a little long, it's over an hour and a half. But toward the end of the debate, they sort of get into individual autonomy and right of succession. Kokesh asks Vaush if he thinks he should be able to take his 10 acres he bought in Arizona and just form an independent nation, and, basically just be left alone there. And Vaush replied by saying no, he shouldn't be free to be independent. He should be forcibly subjugated into a collective against his will, citing, of course, law and order. So I guess according to Vaush's own logic, he must be racist then.
This law and order shit is and always has been a fucking dog whistle, okay? From day one.
So for those of you who aren't aware, the term dog whistle is sort of part of the left-wing vernacular. Basically, it's a catch-all word used to describe anything someone says that can even remotely be construed as racist.
You people don't give a fuck about law and order. Republicans have been jerking themselves off about rising up and overthrowing the government, like relentless. Like that's every day you listen to fucking conservative talk radio and they're like, yeah, listen up, you fellow patriots. I hope all you went out there and took advantage of the ammunition sales that went on 4th of July, because we're going to be needing that pretty soon when the cops start coming to your door and you're going to shoot them.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Vaush here. Conservatives are sort of like faux libertarians. They use libertarian rhetoric and talking points to support their campaign but don't actually believe any of it. Like, they claim to believe in small government and individual rights, but they'll usually turn around and advocate for things like border control, drug restrictions, police brutality.
Like, these people don't care about law and order. They care about law and order in very specific intersections of law and civil activism when it's possible to use that as a bludgeon against black people, indigenous people, or other minority groups that are trying to protest.
So if that were actually the case, then conservatives would actually be in favor of lockdowns, because these lockdowns are actually bulldozing through small black-owned businesses and transferring insane amounts of money to big corporations, which are usually owned and run by white people.
But yeah, just please keep that in mind, okay? And they're going to keep doing this too, by the way. They will oscillate between these positions rapidly. They will nonstop vibrate between these. Anyway, the point that I'm laboriously trying to get to is conservatives are pieces of shit, and they are anti-life.
So first of all, the point you're supposedly trying to get to in this video is a vague, meaningless ad hominem that doesn't really say anything. But also, I thought the point you were trying to get across was that conservatives are hypocritical. Now you're trying to say they're anti-life. Like, the main thesis of this video seems to be inconsistent and keeps jumping around.
At least the big people like this, anti-life, okay? That's what they are.
So the people who don't want you to be deprived of happiness and joy and all the things that give life meaning are anti-life. But the people who advocate for lockdowns, which increase things like suicide and starvation, are somehow not anti-life.
I don't know what else you can say about COVID-19. Remember back when everyone was sanitizing their groceries because of COVID-19? Like, everyone was being real careful about it. Right now, we have like 10 times the number of cases per day that we had back then.
So a case simply just indicates a positive COVID-19 test. An increase in cases might not necessarily mean that the virus is getting worse. It may mean that testing is increasing, or it may also mean that there's more false positives.
And they're doing shit like this. You know, the only reason this country is buckling so hard under COVID-19 is because of people like this.
Yeah, no. Even with all the dissent out there, people have still mostly been following all the rules, wearing masks, social distancing, closing their businesses. So yeah, nice try, but no cigar.
We're going to be doing this shit until fucking 2025, okay?
You know, I was kind of thinking that way myself, but it looks like several states have decided to actually reopen. I guess there is a little shimmer of hope out there that people are starting to see this fake liberal pandemic for what it is. Just hot air.
Even some states will do better than others, of course, because some states have more Democrats than others.
I'm sorry, but isn't this Vaush guy supposed to be an anarchist? And yet here he is supporting Democrats?
We see where it's exploding right now. It's in the fucking Midwest. The Midwest is the place that's buckling the most right now under COVID-19. You know why? So many of these people...
So according to Vaush, it's states run by Republicans that are doing worse with COVID. But the data doesn't really bear that out. Democrat-run states like New York, Michigan, and California are getting slammed, while Republican states like Florida and Texas are actually doing pretty good. Texas recently lifted their mask mandate and their lockdowns. They're back to 100% capacity. They're experiencing a decrease in cases. And Florida never locked down to begin with, and they're still like in the bottom 20 in terms of cases. So this data very clearly undermines the idea that lockdowns do anything to actually slow the spread of the virus. All they really do is destroy the economy and ruin lives. But Vaush doesn't really say anything that interesting for the rest of the video, so I think I'll end it here. Before I end the video though, there is one thing I'd like to comment on. He claims that conservatives only care about law and order when it comes to screwing over minorities, but I would make the claim that it's the left wing that only cares about minorities when it's convenient for their political agenda, otherwise they could give a rat's ass about them. Like when you try to point out to left-wingers that a lot of the policies they advocate for, like gun control, minimum wage, social security, zoning laws, like a lot of the things the left advocates for screws over minorities, and when you point this out to them, they don't seem to care. As a matter of fact, the only time the left raises a stink about police brutality is when the victim is black. Like when the fucking SWAT team gunned down a 10-year-old kid in Texas, the liberals didn't say a word about it. You know why? Because he was white. So bottom line of this video, conservatives are hypocrites. Liberals are hypocrites. The only political ideology that's thoroughly consistent is libertarianism. Conservatives want to take your drugs but want to keep their guns. Liberals want to take your guns but keep their drugs. Libertarians want everyone to have their guns and drugs as long as they're not hurting anyone. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Thanks for watching, have a good one.